Let's talk about democracy and then apply democracy, the idea, to the situation of Saddam Hussein's election in Iraq, I believe 2002. We sometimes think of democracy or majority rule as a clean outweighing of the minority vote, in which the minority accepts that they have fairly lost and accepts and consents to the results. But democracy can also be a very dangerous situation if rights and liberties are not protected by law. If your rights are simply one vote away, then all bets are off, in a sense, that all someone would have to do to legitimize terrible crimes against someone would just be get to enough people to vote for it. And that arguably is not legitimate, but that is the situation of just pure majority rule. Now, in scenario number one here, I have different candidates. These could also work with policies. Candidates A through E. And A gets 60% of the vote, and B through E get each 10% of the vote, making up 100. So A gets a clear majority, A wins. Now, the thing to think about with that is 40% voted for a non-A candidate. And yet, even though they clearly did not consent to A, the argument would be that they consented to the system. But A is what they receive, even though they purposefully vote against A. Okay. There's also other ways. So this is a system of majority. Now, simple majority is 51%. So it's really 51 out of 100. Enough to say for everybody that everybody agrees to the results, no matter what they may be. Okay, not just should we go get ice cream or frozen yogurt, and 51% or over half determines that, but should we have slavery or not? I mean, should a majority just determine that? So in this next one, this is an example of a plurality. Candidates A through E again, except A gets 42%, which is less than a majority. However, with the breakdown of the rest of the candidates, 21, 5, 18, 24, A still gets the most. A would still technically win. But in this situation, candidates B through E constitute a majority. Now, they didn't vote together. A still got most of the votes. Most people who were able to get together did vote for A. But most people, 58%, a majority, voted for non-A. Should A still be elected? Now, sometimes they would do a runoff with this type of thing. Another situation, which we may prefer to see more, is where there's a clear majority, 95% vote for A, and the rest get minimal, 1%, 2% of the vote. This is a mandate for an election. However, just because there's 95% of the vote there doesn't necessarily mean that there's, in some cases, even legitimate opposition. Let me talk about the election of Saddam Hussein. Okay, so Saddam Hussein, the military dictator of Iraq, for a long time, long complicated relationship between Saddam Hussein and his own people, Saddam Hussein in relation to the United States. Not going to get into that right now. But Saddam Hussein won a referendum vote. There was a vote for him. He was not running against anyone else. The referendum vote was to continue his presidency for another 7 years. In Iraq at this time, there were 11,445,638 eligible voters. Okay, this does not mean every single person in Iraq. This is eligible voters. Now, there was a 12-hour period of voting where there were secret ballots, but people opted not to use them most of the time. They voted openly, showing that they were voting for Saddam Hussein. No one else was on the ballot, but they wanted to show openly because they were intimidated. Now, in the United States, the election in which people participate most is every 4 years, the presidential election. And on an election where the people are very actualized to vote and very interested in the election and actually we get the most people out to vote is in presidential elections. And at that time, we get about half, about 50% of the people, on a good day, will go out and vote for the president. And that's every 4 years. Local elections can range sometimes in less than 1% of the people who could vote do. That's in very local areas where they have the most impact. Now, that's in the United States. Infrastructure, free, fair, frequent elections where there are several places available to vote. There's voting by mail. There's going to the polls that are open all day. They're open to people getting there later. All these things to try to get people to vote. Now, that is still to say, not all the people who could vote do, because there are people working, there are people elderly, there are people who are sick, there are people without maybe proper identification. There are all kinds of issues that maybe people forget, all kinds of different things going on, which not everybody who could vote does. We get about 50% for the presidential. What was claimed in Iraq was that they got 100% of the electorate showed up and voted, all for Saddam Hussein. All 11,445,638 people, without exception, in a 12-hour period, it is claimed, showed up and voted for Saddam Hussein. Now, we have a 12-hour period here for voting, right? The voting polls open in the morning, and they're supposed to close at 8 p.m. But in California, they don't. They stay open later as people continue to trickle in. But they're claiming in Iraq, a unanimous vote over a 12-hour period, over 11 million people, every single one of them, without exception, shows up and votes for Saddam Hussein. People were afraid of voting no because they were feared they may be tracked otherwise. Some even voted to show the cameras in their bloody fingerprints to show their support. Now, Saddam Hussein won 100%, a super majority of the electorate. But is this legitimate democracy? Saddam Hussein running unopposed through intimidation and an impossibility. You can't get all those people to show up to vote. It's theoretically possible, but practically impossible to get every single eligible voter to show up and vote. That doesn't occur. And so this was a sham election. But if you were a dictator, would you go through this process? Would you have an election at all? Because if you know what, and you're going to manufacture and control what the results are going to be, why even bother having an election? Why even take the risk that someone might try to vote no in the system and withdraw their consent at all? Well, voting possibly offers the idea of legitimacy. Iraq could claim to be a democracy. It brings the idea that the president or whoever's voted for, or whatever policy, has a clear mandate from the will of the people. And so this idea, this veneer of authority that comes from voting is even recognized by tyrants like Saddam Hussein, who used voting to further their tyrannical rule and manufacture the results so that they could win. But the larger question is, how do we know when voting goes from being illegitimate, with obvious examples like Iraq, to legitimate, where the minority has truly consented to the process and its results, and are not just voting in order to avoid, to protect themselves.